Hello, and welcome to the Special Needs Sibling Podcast, where we talk about what life is really like as a sibling to someone with special needs. I'm your host, Charlene, and today, all the way from Singapore, is our guest, Sharon. Thank you for being on the podcast, and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Charlene. I'm so excited to be chatting today. It's the highlight of my week.
Yay! That's so exciting. Yeah, it's been fun just to like meet everyone, and it's cool because like we bonded over so many like small things too. So I'm very excited. Cool. So I guess we'll hop into it. Can you lay out your family structure, like birth order, who has a disability, and a little bit about them?
Okay, so I come from a family of five. So we have three siblings all together. So it's myself and two sisters. I'm the eldest, and then my youngest sister is the one with the special needs. Her name is Priscilla, and she's got mild intellectual disability. Yeah, so I'm the oldest, and I was basically the mommy's helper since she was a baby, because we do have quite a big age gap between us. So my mom would take care of her in the day, then I would be the one rotating at night, changing her diapers and all that. Yeah,
Cool. Yeah, that's different. Well, I'm also the oldest, but the difference is that like me and my sister, we're only like 2 years apart. But you have more than that
we do.
between
We
your
have about
sisters. So
10 years, yeah, between us.
yeah, so that's definitely like you're definitely old enough to kind of hop in and like want to help and like do all these, and you can do these things. Versus I was like 5 year olds. You can't really like do a whole lot, but that's
You'll be
okay. There's
surprised a 5-year-old can do quite a bit. But as a 10-year-old, I got into a space where it's also because I come from a more traditional Asian family, so like the oldest is kind of expected to help out in a way too, and I was
mm-hmm.
glad for it. But in a way, I became like an extra pair of hands, and then I'll be the one taking care of her at night, and then in the day go to school, at night take care of her. That's also
Yeah.
because my mom was kind of she had to recover from having her at a later age. Yeah, so there was a
Okay.
lot that she was going through. Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah, that it's always like an interesting thing that every oldest sibling I talk to always there's always more like of a caregiving, like you always look out, and I think that's a normal characteristic even if like our siblings were like typical, but it's just
Typical, yeah.
it's all yeah, but it's always just kicks in like almost into like overdrive when there's a disability and stuff like that. Um, so I guess in the open forum part of the show, what would you like to talk about? We have lots to talk about, but is there any particular subjects that like for you like are really important or that you really want to talk about or have questions about, things like that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really sits on heavily on my heart is, the need for, I think, as special needs siblings, when you have a person with, special needs coming into the family, I think the family dynamics can change up quite a fair bit. And I was part of an event where we were, I was one of the human books that was in this human library, and then I got chatting and sharing my story about, being a caregiver and also a sibling. And one of the parent came up to me and she started talking about how her child has got GDD, which is global developmental delay. And then she was chatting about how she was really struggling to make sense of it, and also just how she was going to be able to relate to her other children who were difficult, right? So we got talking, and then it really hit me very hard that all I could do at that session was really to give her an encouragement that there is no manual in being a parent or a caregiver of a special needs loved one. And the thing about being a sibling, or having a child that it has a sibling with special needs, is that like you, as a parent, as a caregiver, we tend to like have all of our attention on the person that has the need, right? But then
Mm-hmm.
what about those that are around us? So it's really my heart and intent to bring a little bit more light into this space, to really encourage all of us to really think about the family as a whole, to think about the individuals that are in the family unit, just so that we can take better care of each other, and then we don't neglect any one of us in the family. Yeah.
Yeah, the attention thing is something that it's interesting because I think for me I didn't even realize it till I was an adult that that's what was important,
Mm.
because I feel like when I was growing up I didn't like it's not something like that I noticed that like I was getting less attention necessarily, but like as I got older it's something I noticed more. But it's almost ironic because the time when you need the attention is when you're younger,
Yeah.
right? Because then that's when you kind of cultivate like the that like you're being loved and that you're being nurtured and that you're cared for, right? And that's all these kind of emotions and feelings that we don't quite have the vocabulary for when we're younger. but
Mm.
then
The sense
but
of
it's like
safety
as you get
and
older you like you can feel a disconnect almost like as you grow, which I don't know the science behind that, but I feel like that's, at least for me, that's what I've noticed as I think about it.
yeah, yeah. Because the thing with my own family is that when my sister came into our family, we were full of joy, but there was also a sense of like, okay, what's gonna shift now, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
between my youngest and I, we actually have another sister between us, right? And for the longest time, like we've always been really close. And then we did a lot of things together. But then when the youngest came into the family, then it became like, okay, we had to make certain adjustments, and then our relationship started shifting into a different direction. So
Okay.
it's I wouldn't say it's good or bad. It is the way it was, but then I think
Mm-hmm.
it's you know um just kind of being mindful that, like, when you have an addition to the family, that way, especially one requiring more attention, I think it's really important to, like, make sure that the rest of the family is also being taken care of. It's easier said than done, for sure, but then it's that, just remembering that we are individuals, but then we are
Yeah.
also a unit together. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing now versus like in the 90s when it was just very different, right? Because the amount of information and technology and all these things were different, but I think like now there's so many more like the mental health conversation is so much bigger than it was before, and part of that I think is just the awareness of kind of yourself and your family, right? I think that's something that's very different because I'm pretty sure like for my parents, like it's not like they were in groups where they would tell them, oh, you need to make sure of all the things that we're talking about right now, because that just was no one knew at that time because
Yeah.
it was just so different, like the diagnosis and stuff. And I think that's even regardless of like, even if I'm in the U.S., like I think as a whole, like in the world, it's just everything is kind of just different at that time with the
Mm,
diagnoses and like
mm.
parenting and the whole thing.
Yeah, there was just no language to it, and that there was no, it was even a taboo in some sense too, to have someone with special needs. And I remember, like, with my sister's diagnosis, MID, in the early days it was called mental retardation. I mean, you could get thrown a stone today for using a term like that, right? but
Yeah.
but that was the language that was the language back then. And it's that, people didn't quite know what to make, how to make any sense of it. And there was no, like, facilitation of a conversation. There was no safe space. There was no
Mm-hmm.
support group, right? So I think our parents in the early days, even early caregivers, had it really rough. And like what I told the mom that day at the session, there's no manual, and I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of slack as well, just
Yeah.
just knowing that, we're having it difficult to deal with, this circumstance, and let's not make it harder for ourselves and the people around us,
Yeah.
by labeling or stepping on, unhelpful labels or confusing labels, and also adding unnecessary pressure onto ourselves, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too, where like the I think something I didn't realize until now, like after I started seeing my therapist, right, is how like different is one way to put it, but it's just like it is hard, right? But like you
Mm,
don't. But like when you're a kid, you just like, oh, that's just you're in your bubble of your household, and that's just like how you function and you interact with the world the way you do, and you don't know until you get exposure, right? And so it was this interesting thing when I had met my husband's family when we were dating at the time, and it was this thing. It was just the exposure to different types of people and different families, and how
mm,
they like interact with each other and how they view the world, because it was just so different than how I grew up, and it so that because I remember like one of the harder things for me to do when I was little was like we had these like very big family gatherings, which is fine. Like that's just part of like when you're like in an Asian family, you have lots of like dinners and stuff. But the thing that was hard was when we had them in like the really big dinners for like for Christmas, Thanksgiving, all the big holidays and stuff. So the house we would have to drive to was probably like an hour away. Right, so that was hard because it's like, well, you don't want to only go for like an hour because you're already driving an hour, so there's all these things. And I remember when I was there, because we didn't live near where everybody else did, I felt very like oh, like I don't know anyone. What do I do? And so I'm just like sitting in this corner like by myself because it's not like I can talk to my sister because she can't talk, and so it's
Mm-hmm.
like okay, but then when I met my husband's family, where his family's just kind of like it's almost like my extended family is the size of his immediate family. That's just like how it worked out. But there was just so many people, so at the beginning I used to be like very like, oh no, like it's gonna happen again, right? Like when I was like 8 or 7, I was like so afraid. But then he's like, no, it's not. You can just hang out, right? You don't have to talk to someone. You can talk to people. Like you can eat. Like it doesn't. Like I wasn't obligated to do anything. All I had to do was like show up and just yeah, just be present. And so I was like, oh, so that was a really interesting shift to learn, just like how other people can fun, how other families kind of just operate in the world.
You know, family gatherings are so interesting because you anticipate, you look forward to seeing family, but some of these gatherings can be really nerve wracking. And you know, in Singapore, we have this culture of visiting our relatives, especially during the New Year period, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's kind of interesting too because the thing about having my sister with her her condition is that every time we would visit relatives that we have not seen for a long, long time, you run into the very inevitable question of, how is your sister doing? Is she going to school? How is school? And then, then yada, 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 yada. It's like, the standard questions that, they know to ask because usually, I mean, in Singapore, we are quite academically driven. So
Okay.
parents and adults are usually very concerned with school performance and that sort of thing. So it's
Okay.
kind of interesting because like every year, like we would I would be in charge of answering that question in that sense. I took it upon myself, not that my parents expected it of me, but I think it's a big sister thing, just really wanting to protect my sister. So I
Mm-hmm.
would I would tell them about what she's doing and then how she's progressing, and it's interesting to watch the reactions of the relatives because they ask this question out of love and concern. But a lot of times it's also because they don't quite know how to place her. Like
Oh.
how do you then make sense of like like she's at this age right now, but then maybe she's still in this particular track, or she's still schooling at this level when her peers have gone out to work, for example. So it's kind of interesting to watch like their reactions and all that. But I know they do it out of love and concern, so that's really sweet. It's just that you run into the inevitable question of society not really quite knowing where to place you. Yeah, just because you don't fall into like you're just not running on the standard track, if you will. You know.
Yeah. And I forgot to ask you this earlier, but like for your sister's condition, could you like describe kind of like either fun facts about her personality or kind of like how her condition works or not works? That's not the but you know what I mean. That's not the right way to phrase that, but you
Yeah.
know what I mean.
Yeah, no, it's all good. She with MID, the thing is that her cognitive abilities are a little bit underdeveloped, if you will. She is in her 20s right now, but she's also not quite able to really understand the world at that level that you would think she is able to. But at the
Okay.
same time, she surprises me all the time. Like she's really good with technology, really, really good with technology. A couple of years ago, she got her very first smartphone
Okay.
because her friends were all really wanting to do
Oh
things
yeah, everyone
online.
has like video. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and then I gave her a elderly friendly phone, with the large buttons and all that. It
Yeah,
was so
yeah,
unusual for her to bring to school.
yeah.
So she was starting not to use it. Initially she got excited because that elderly phone, she could still listen to the radio on it. So initially she was really excited about it, but then when she went to school and then she realized that her friends could do so much more on their phones than
Uh-huh.
her little elderly phone. So then she decided that she wasn't going to use it. But anyway, we got her a smartphone, so she was using it, and then I think she started running into problems online. We started seeing really like strange requests, like male trying to approach her and all that,
Oh yeah.
and it was getting quite finicky. So then I put in some parental controls. I talked to her
Oh
about
yeah,
it,
yeah,
but then
yeah.
I
That
put
makes
in some
sense.
parent. Yeah, yeah. But I talked to her about it, and then we put in some parental controls. But you know what? She bypassed everything. She bypassed all of my parental controls. I was like, what? Like I was locking myself out of the phone, but there she was, cruising along, and she could bypass all of my parental controls. And I was like, what? Like, and then it hit me that she may be labeled, she may have this label over her, but actually really she's created to be so much more than that
Mm.
diagnosis, if you will. She has got so much abilities, and not just technology, but also she's got a really sweet and lovable personality.
Yeah.
She's that kind of person that, like, if she were to see that you are hurt, right, she would like run to go get like a plaster for you. And she's that kind
Oh.
of person that would remember your injury, like even months down the road, even years down the road. Like she
Oh,
would come back
wow.
to you and
That's
she'll check
impressive.
in with you. Yeah, yeah. So I think with her, yes, maybe she does have some, maybe she is not as developed as she could be, in some
Yeah.
aspects, but I feel like her heart is so big, and she's taught me so many lessons, that these are lessons I'll treasure for life. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Because it's, yeah, the yeah, it's interesting kind of like their cognitive level versus kind of like their physical body and their hormones versus like what's actually happening in their brain like are not, they're like not the same thing at all, right? Because it's like cognitively like my sister like does either does certain like behaviors of a certain like age, right? And it's like, oh, okay, like you open the fridge or like you want your snacks or like you know how to tie your shoes and there's things like that, but there's like her comprehension of other things that are happening are like very beyond
Yeah.
what the cognitive level of like developmentally kind of like at whatever age, and it's so fascinating how they use that to like interact with the world, because I always knew that she understood more than we thought, but I think even to that level like there's just so much more to it inside than
Yes. Yeah.
anybody maybe even themselves realizes, right? Because it's just the limitation is not their brain, it's all these other things that are preventing them from being able to communicate what they need or want
Mm.
to say, not that they can't take in the information necessarily.
Yeah, and I feel like it's also a compensatory mechanism, if you will. It's almost like they're built whole in a different way. It's like, yeah, maybe one part of it isn't working as well, quote unquote, in air quotes, right?
Yeah.
As it could be, but then they are created to have other elements that would come forth and play out at their strengths, play out as their strengths, or even become their protective covering, if you will. It's like my sister. I think for her, her sense of emotion, her sense of like just being able to read the room. She's
Mm.
really good with being able to read the room, and she's really good with being able to read a person. Like she
Oh.
kind of knows how to use that to her advantage, especially when she's trying to get extra screen time. Then she
Yeah,
will,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, she'll know how to like read the signs in the room, and then she'll know how to approach you and all that. So I feel like it's just that they're made differently, and it's not for better or for worse, it's just different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The different, and I think it's this thing where like it's almost like it just, so I have this like theory hypothesis, I don't know what to call it, where my whole thing is like, as a sibling, it's very much like a roller coaster, right? There's like good days, there's
Mm-hmm.
bad days, and all these things. But in my philosophy theory, whatever it's called, like there comes a point where you hit this wall, and you can choose kind of to go right or left, right? And you can go, one way is to kind of jump into it, and you're kind of very like involved with your sibling and kind of like in that space, versus kind of there's other people who kind of they walk away for whatever reason, right? And that could be related to their sibling or their parents or some other external um situation that has caused them to walk away. But it's such an interesting thing, because it's like every like kind of like what you were saying earlier about like when parents ask like what can I do for my kids that are typical, right? But it's even us like as siblings who are typical, like if I were to ever give advice to someone who was younger than me, like I don't, it's so specific to
Mm,
like their internal kind of like battles they have to face, right? Because there's going to be battles that I had with my sister and my parents that may or may not exist for them, and that changes so much of the dynamic in how they interact with their sibling and in the world. And that's, it's something that I've, it's been so fascinating because you and I can relate on like very like we there's like a kind of like a list of things we relate on. There's a list of things we don't relate on, and but
mm,
there's also like very key kind of like paradigm shifts that we have
mm,
in our lives, right? Where we've decided, oh, we're gonna go this trajectory due to something that's happened,
mm,
and I feel like as a sibling, there's a much higher percentage that that paradigm shift is due to your sibling, not versus like, oh, you know, you found out you're really good at basketball or something, or like, oh, you know what, you won $1 million. Like, there's stuff like that, but like, there's so many other things where, like, I like, yeah, there's just certain situations and people like we would have never met, right? Like, if my sister didn't have a disability, like we would have just not met. Just
yeah,
period.
yeah.
And so yeah, it's just kind of interesting how kind of like, which that might be a little bit too like philosophical, but it's still, it's just interesting how it kind of all plays in together. Like when like yeah, and just because they're different doesn't make it good or bad. It's just that's who they are, and it's kind of like how do we function with them and then incorporate them as they are.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think you just said it so perfectly. You know, it's the summation of our life experiences, really. I mean, the thing about being a sibling to somebody with special needs. I mean, how different is that going to be from our life experience in, I don't know, in the work that you do in the audio space, in the work I do as a nutritionist. I mean, like how can they not influence the way we think and the way we make sense of this thing that we call life, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, I feel like it comes down to really this being part of our life experiences. And I think the trouble comes when we let that shape and form our sense of identity,
Mm-hmm.
and our
Yeah.
sense of the world, like in totality. And I think the more, like, I don't know whether this is something that comes with age or something, but the more I grow in years, the more I feel like I don't know anything.
Right.
It's like you think you know it all, like when you're in your 20s. Like it's kind of a stinky attitude really to have in your 20s. I don't know if you're like that, but I was like that in my 20s, all right? So it's you kind of feel like, oh, you're on top of the world, like you kind of know it all
Yeah,
and
you
all
very
that,
very much like you have like an idea of like who you are in the world. Like you have a very like stable idea of what you perceive the world to be. Yeah, that I
Yes, and
understand.
until more life happens, and then it shakes up, your very
Yeah.
fundamental sense of identity, right? And
Yes.
so I feel like the more I grow up, the more I feel like I don't know, and the more I need to learn. And you're so spot on. I mean, like how do we even give advice, right, to someone? I mean,
Yeah.
the context is so important. The dynamics are so different, and also whether the person is willing and able to make sense of what has just been said to them. I mean, all this all play a part, right? And so yeah, I think it's just a matter of having life experiences and using that to our advantage. And I think a lot of us may see that being a caregiver or sibling to someone with special needs, I think it's often seen as a baggage, but I feel like it's
Mm.
something that we should see as a plus because I think you would agree with me, Charlene. The thing about having a sibling with special needs is that it increases our sense of empathy and
Yes.
sensitivity, right, to those
Yeah.
around us. And I don't know if I never had a sibling like that, I don't know that I would have entered this world. I don't know that I would have known how to interact with people. And I'm still learning ways to learn how to interact with persons with
Yeah.
special needs. I mean, it's a day by day thing, and I don't know that this part of the world would have been visible to me, right? What is so
Mm-hmm.
invisible in terms of just this type of need and yeah. So I feel like a lot of times we talk about it as like, oh, we've been weighed down by this. This was part of my childhood. I've had to do things that my peers didn't have to do. But I feel like it has also lent us a lot of strength and perspective, in
Yeah.
yeah, and it's really helped shape like how I see the world today and how I interact with the world today. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such a complex thing, and that because I
Mm,
think yeah, and I think that's so important too. Like what you bring up about like understanding that like it helps shapes us also for the better
mm,
as a general statement, right? And I think, right at this period in time, I think I'm just going through kind of the like the downward part of the roller coaster where it's a little bit not as happy. But I think there's so many. But one thing that right now that is good is this podcast, which is like something that I would have never like foreseen happening, but just things happen and then here we are. And it's one of those things where even though like right now at this point in time I feel very like in my downward part of my roller coaster, like the thing that's like giving me lots of hope is like being able to like have it have my feelings like validated by other siblings, right? And even if those other people like they're more positive or negative or neutral or whatever it is, it's very reassuring to just know that like you're not the only person on the planet that feels like this. It's so intense, and I think that's a whole other level of it, right? Like it's one thing I feel like my emotions are just very intense sometimes, like when it comes to this topic, right? So whether it's with my sister or other people with disabilities or when I'm just in the community, like it's just very I feel very like I'm it's much easier to get very excited or angry or whatever versus kind of like a neutral topic, because I'm sure people feel like that way about like sports or something, right? Like, oh, you're totally fine and you can go watch a sport that you really like and then you get very
Then you become
excited or
more.
angry, it's kind of like that type of thing.
You're describing my husband, I think, on a
Really?
good. He becomes a different man when he goes into his gaming room, his man
Yeah.
cave. But yeah, yeah. So he becomes so impassioned, and he's normally a passionate guy, but he becomes more impassioned when he goes into his man cave. But anyway, I feel like the amazing thing is that what you're sharing here, I want to thank you for being so vulnerable, Charlene, because I think it's not easy when you're dealing with such complex feelings and emotions to actually desire to want to step out and seek help,
Yeah.
especially in an Asian context. I know you grew up in the US, so that's a little bit different in that sense. But
Mm-hmm.
still asking for help is never easy.
Yeah.
Right, and I feel like you talk about the roller coaster, right, and I totally can relate to that. But the beautiful thing is that when it's going down, the only way up,
It's
the
up.
only way
Yeah.
else is up, right? You can only go up from there. And I think it's really amazing also that you have developed such a space for yourself, for others to come on board and come into this space to share their experiences. And I don't know where would where we would go, if it's not for a platform like this podcast. And
Yeah.
it's amazing. I think we chatted before this about how I first came across the podcast. I was searching exactly for this thing. I was
Mm-hmm.
looking for I was typing in special needs siblings, and then I was like nothing came up, nothing came up. I've been an avid
Yep.
podcast listener for years, right? And then nothing
Yeah.
came out until one fine day in March. I was like, what? Like like, am I seeing things like, is this new? Like, I don't think I've seen it before. And when I listened in, I realized that, oh, this it's amazing. Like to have a space like this. And then when I heard your story, then yeah, it lends so much more strength to it, because I was like, oh wow, like she not only is getting the help that she needs, but also she's creating a safe environment for siblings to come in and tell their stories. Yeah. So I just really want to say
Yeah.
thank you, Charlene.
Yeah. Thanks. That definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. It's been this thing where like to get it was so scary to do it, but then I had a similar experience in terms of like there was like a couple of months I was just looking, and I was looking for anything. I was like books, podcasts, radio, movies, like something, and I was just like, why doesn't it exist? Like there's so many of us in the world, right? And it's so fascinating because it's like the people who are siblings, even the people who like aren't involved in the space of being in a disability community, but they're just like they just happen to be siblings. They do something completely unrelated, right? Like the hearts of those people are so big, right? The empathy that they have and the sympathy they have is so like it's like it's not that's not measurable, but like it's just so much bigger than we all realize that the care and the love for people, and I think that it like I'm not a parent yet, but that's still different than your child, right? When you have someone in your life like when you're, yeah, when it's you and your sibling, and they don't, and they're like, they're not typical. It's just different than any other relationship, and I can't, that I obviously don't have vocabulary to describe that, but
Mm.
it's just interesting how, like, it's the gift that we're given to be able to foster that type of care and show other people that that care is possible. And
I
I
think
think
so. Yeah.
and I think that's one of the really interesting things with my husband was like, obviously, like when we're dating, that's obviously, it's a deal breaker, right? You can't not have her in the picture. But the as over the years, as I've seen him interact with her and other people, just like at like family retreats or like events and stuff with other people with disabilities, like to see like how he's grown in that particular capacity, right? Because he was a very loving person before, but it's just a different level of understanding and empathy that you learn, right? I think just I've gotten the privilege of like having like one of my very close friends like also change it, and it's one of those things with her, like that one was crazy because like we were very good friends before, and then kind of we had this week together, and then kind of all this other stuff happened, and then like her life very much after that like was very much altered,
Mm.
right? And
Mm.
it sounds extreme, but like we've talked about it actually kind of like a couple months ago. We were kind of talking about how different her life is now just because of like that week that we kind of spent like in interacting with these people and these families, and it's just like there's something very powerful to be said about like the amount of love and care sometimes that comes off in a very kind of not loving way, but they still care. And I think that's what's also so interesting is like, you know to love like a family like that has a disability, that someone's affected by disability, like the love and care that goes into it, like sometimes you care so much that it just comes off kind of in a not so positive light, even though they care.
Mm, mm. And
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful sense of love that you're describing here, because the thing about love is that a lot of times, like, we tend to think that we can only love our own. Like, if you can only love your child, and then like the $1 million question, like if a child and I don't know someone else falls into the water, like who are you going to save? Like we tend to think that we can only love our own. And I think that if you are someone, especially if you're someone who's grounded, like by faith, as I am, sometimes it's you can enjoy a sense of love that is much bigger than yourself, and
Mm-hmm.
you can extend this love to others that don't necessarily belong to you. And if you really think about it, like, what do we really own in this world? I mean, even if you have a child, like, the child could die or you could die. I mean, I'm not trying to be morbid here, but like we don't really own anything that we
Yeah,
hold on to
it's
in
not
this world.
yours to have.
It's
Yeah,
not,
it's
no,
not yours to own. Yeah.
yeah, it's not what you can bring out into this world, out of this world anyway, right? So the thing about, like, love is that, like, we tend to think that we can only love our own. But, like, if you look at the foster parents that are around us, the parents who have chosen to adopt, not because
Yeah.
they can't have children, but to add to their family, even, if you talk about, like, those people who volunteer to visit the elderly, clean out their homes, I mean, like, how do you describe that? And I feel like, when you are, somebody that can see beyond yourself, and you are willing to embrace this sense of love, I think it's you can go so many places, and you can go places that you can't even logically imagine yourself doing. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
beyond you. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's yeah, it's such a powerful thing. And it's also this thing where like it's as positive as we're making it, there's also like boundaries are also very important in terms of like,
Yep.
just because
Yeah.
you love them so much also does not give you the right to then overextend yourself to then jump in the water and save everyone and then you die. Like that's
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
not good either, right? Like there's this balance of like knowing that you have a capacity to love and love very much, but you also have to be able to be loved and love yourself and like kind of
Mm.
foster that in yourself in order to keep loving the people that you want to actually care for and care give for.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. So true. You've got to really, like, take care of yourself before you can, like take care of others in a way, and or you can take care of others while you're taking care of yourself. Like it doesn't have to be I think that's a challenge. Like we tend to be, we tend to think of things in a very binary manner, like it's either this
Mm-hmm.
or that. But what if we can have both? What if it doesn't have to be either? So I yeah, with caregiving, I think we really need to consider our need to maintain boundaries, like what you said. Just like I, as much as I love my sister, I do have to maintain a certain boundary, especially now being married and having a family of my own. I mean, I do need to have that boundary as well, right? And it's also a boundary, not just for my own sake, but also for her, so that she learns to develop a sense of independence, and
Oh, interesting.
also
Yeah.
yeah, and also that she knows that she learns that she cannot always expect to have the attention that she desires all the time, because what good is it
Mm-hmm.
going to do for her, right?
Yeah.
So I think it works both ways, really. Maintaining that sense of boundary, but also at the same time, learning how to take care of our own health, take care of ourselves, so that we can be there for them in a capacity that's enhanced, and not like we're down and out and we're ill, and then like we can't even like take care of ourselves and get ourselves out of bed, and then we're
Yeah.
trying to. It's like, what good
It's
does
not
it do
good.
if
Yeah, that's a bad sign if you can't do that.
yeah, like and I'm not saying that we have to be in perfect health, because some of us do deal with chronic conditions, and
Yeah.
some of us will deal with pain and suffering, like in the course of our day to day, and that's not to minimize that kind of pain and suffering. But what I'm saying is that if you are in a position where you're able to kind of build on your health, however
Mm-hmm.
little you think you have, right? If you're in a position to do that bit by bit, slowly, precept upon precept, you'll be amazed like how far your body can adapt and change and respond to what you're doing to it. And you're
Yeah.
going to be putting yourself in a better position as well in your caregiving. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things that in therapy that like we've been talking about. It's just like you can retrain your brain to like think different and think differently about things. Like you don't yeah, like just because you've thought the same way for so long doesn't mean you can't undo it. Like it might take longer to adjust like as you get older, right? Just because you've spent more time kind of like in the same path, but you can change it. And I think
Mm,
that was something that was so fascinating to me because I think for so long I was very much like, oh, my life is going to be like this. I'm going to have this job, I'm going to do this. And it was very like, and even if I didn't like, even if it wasn't like that, I would plan that way, right?
mm,
I would kind of plan around the way that I thought that people would behave. So I would put like them in this box and go, oh, like they like this thing or they don't like this thing, and then I would then conceive this plan, whatever that was, being that like I didn't like account for that people can make different choices, and I didn't
mm,
like that, and I think that was really tough for me until I learned that I could make different choices. Like it was just so hard because I was very rigid in how I thought about a lot of things. I think I was much more black and white, like earlier, like in my childhood and like young adult life. It's just because that's just that's just what I knew, right? I was like, oh, it's gonna be this or this, and then I didn't like knowing like if it was an unknown factor, because if it was an unknown, that means like anything could go wrong, or I could get hurt, or it was unsafe, or like there's all these kind of like very uneasy feelings if you didn't know what was gonna happen. So for me, it was just easier to like do go black or white. But now
mm,
it's this thing where like, well, I've learned through a very like lots of trial and error and like just like that I can be reassured and like I can make this choice for me and that's okay. And then no
mm,
one else has to like agree with it or anything. Like, but if I feel good about making that choice, then I can just do it. And I think
mm,
just to get to that point has given me the like I feel like like it's given me like a release of having that expectation on everyone else. Because I used to have that expectation of everyone, like, oh, you're going to make these choices, but now it's like, no, like you can make your choice, I will make mine, and somehow we will meet in the middle and like figure it out and be adults. And that's it's been a rough battle, but it feels so much better to be able to do that than to not.
I have to agree. Yeah, I feel like it's you don't have to carry that baggage anymore. It almost feels
Yeah.
like that, in a way. Um, you spoke about that binary thinking. I don't know if it's a case where when you grow up in difficult circumstances as a child,
Mm-hmm.
you learn to develop mechanisms for survival. Maybe that binary thinking was a sense of survival for you. It's at least I'm speaking from my own personal experience. I
Mm-hmm.
had a very difficult childhood growing up, and that's another story for another day. But it's I learned to develop many. Now I think of them as capabilities, but back then, it's like it's all I knew to do. It's a
Mm-hmm.
very binary sense of thinking. It's yes, no. It's you learn how to read the room very early on from a very young age, and you learn to be very alert and attuned to what's going on around you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back then, like that's all I knew to do. And for then and when I became a young adult, there were many things I despised about it. I hated that bit of my childhood. But then now that I'm much older, I feel like no, I should embrace that as part of my story. I should embrace that as part of my upbringing. I should really embrace that as part of what has contributed to who I am today. And if
Yeah.
it's not for those experiences, right, I would not have pivoted in another direction. So I think it's yeah, like I think we tend to be very hard on ourselves, and we tend to struggle and we tend to not talk about it, until we hear that somebody else has a similar experience, come, let's share about that, and
Yeah.
then we go into a conversation. But yeah, I feel like that's things happen for a reason. They were the way they were for a reason beyond us. And I think if we learn to just keep an open mind about that and just move with life, we can find ourselves moving through life with a lot more ease. That doesn't make life easier by any stretch of imagination, but it's a baggage that we don't have to carry and we can let that go. And
Yeah.
the thing about control is that I feel like they always say what the fear of public speaking is like the number one fear, right? But I kind of beg to differ. I feel like the sense of control, letting go of the sense of control, is maybe what people fear the most. We make the perfect plans, and we don't want to dirty our planner that we get on 1st January, and then we want to write in the perfect boxes and squares and all that. Like we want to tick it off. We want to be able to control that. And I can't help but wonder if it's a sense of us actually feeling very very out of control within ourselves, and then desiring to control our external environment. But the bigger question is how effective is that going to be for the long haul. And for me, at least, my own personal experience is that like I found that by letting go of the desire to control, I found myself to be much much happier.
Mm.
There's so many things that are beyond me. Like I can make the necessary preparations. I can plan on saying certain things. I can plan on doing certain things, but I won't know how the other person is going to receive it. The other person might be dealing with another battle on his or her part, right? And who is to know like what's going on with their mind, at a point in time. So like, who am I to think that like it should go this way or that? So I don't know. Like I'm the more I contemplate this matter, the more I find that I'm more at peace with myself when I can come to realize that this world is not something that I should strive to control. But and there's really so much that I can't. But the one thing, if I must control something, the one thing is myself. My own response, my own thinking about this, and it
Yeah.
comes down to renewing our minds and retraining our thought process. Just like what you're saying earlier.
Yeah. And I think so much of that too is like just believing in yourself that you can do it. And I think
Mm.
that's something, and I think that's why I struggled with it for so long, was just because I didn't believe that I could let go. And I mean, and some other things that you mentioned too, but I think that you know, like you do have the power. Like yeah, like believing in yourself gives you the power and the ability to be able, to let go and to acknowledge that there are other things in the universe that you can't control, and there. And I think the other thing with that is like it is not yours to control. Kind of like earlier, right? Like the things that you own on the earth, it's like yes, you own them, but at the end of the day, like they are not they're not necessarily yours to own, right? Your kids, your family, your house, whatever, right? And it's about being a good steward of those things and
Mm.
understanding that you have a responsibility to foster care and to steward it well, but you don't need to be greedy about it and to like uphold it to like a perfect standard or anything. But I think like one of the things you said earlier is that like we're so hard on ourselves, right? Like siblings in general, I think, and I don't know if that's a more being the oldest sibling or just any sibling in general, like about being hard on us. But I'm pretty sure as the oldest one, we were always just on ourselves about like, what can we do? How can we make it better? Like, are they gonna be okay? Like, right? And then there's always the added part of that is also the like we end up being the caretaker later, right? We're gonna caregive because our parents, like, we're the next one after them, right?
Mm. Mm.
Regardless of however many other siblings you have, if you're the oldest, that is gonna end up being your responsibility unless if you choose to walk away from that, right? And it's this thing where it's that's a very big like that is a big burden to carry, but it doesn't have to be a burden. But it's about the balancing of being able to believe in yourself that you can ask for help and that you
Mm.
have the people around you to support that, and then also believing in that your sibling can also, to the best of their ability, exercise their own independence or their right to speak or have an opinion or whatever capacity, because everyone's sibling's different. And that's and that's a very like that's its own relationship too that is interesting, which at some point later I have some other people lined up that will have older siblings. I think they themselves are older siblings who are in that position where they're caretaking, right? And that's a whole other like level of caretaking versus like where we're at, where our parents are alive. We're married, our sisters are kind of just in a separate space, but like we're still kind of interacting in the back and forth and we're involved. But and that's its own kind of like dance around kind of like what's what do we prioritize, right? Are we prioritizing them or us, our husbands, our parents? And that's its own kind of and that's its own not battle, but it's its own dance too, because it's like, right, because in Asian cultures as a general statement, like family's important, but it's like, well, those are all our family members, so how do you pick between your current like it's very there's a lot to that, and I think there's a lot to be said for like the amount of like strength that we have to consistently kind of like refuel ourselves with the self-care to be able to love all those people that we have in our lives, because they are all very important to us.
Yeah, they are. And in a way, we have to be really organized as well with our time and our our schedules and all
Yeah.
that. Yeah, like when COVID hit, I homeschooled my sister for that season, and it was tremendously difficult because I had to balance my business, and then on top of that, I had to balance my caregiving, and then my husband got into an accident, a road accident during that period too, so I had to caregive for him too. So there was just a lot going on in
Yeah.
the span of those couple of years. So yes, my mom, I'm very, very, very blessed that my mom is well and alive, and she's the primary caregiver. But then I'm kind of like the behind the scenes planner, if you will, as we're talking about earlier. But so I coordinate the rest of her care and also her educational needs and all that. So it's quite a lot on my plate. But the thing about it is that, like, you have to find a way to fit them all in, but not at the expense of your own healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Your own self-care. Yeah. And the amazing thing is that there are ways to make it work. It's a creativity exercise, really, and
Yeah.
sometimes it involves, kind of putting two things together, but sometimes it also involves just clearing out your schedule a little bit, so that you have that breathing space. But it's totally possible. It's doable. I think it really comes down to just being intentional about your time,
Yeah.
and really having knowing that some things are going to have to slide, or be put on the back burner for a season, while you focus on
Yeah.
certain aspects of your caregiving. Yeah.
Yeah, and seasons are so important, because I was actually going to bring that up also, because like as we were talking, I was like, oh, like that, and that's a whole other thing too, right? There's seasons where you do work a lot, and there's seasons where you caregive a lot. There's seasons where like you can take a break and you don't have to you don't feel like you're obligated to do things for other people, right? There's seasons of like happiness and sadness, and I think that's also important, that like it's not going to be, it's not going to feel like a burden forever. Like it will be there, just kind of like how you look at it, right? Because there's times where it's going to be like a big gift. There's going to be times where it's a burden. There's going to be times where it feels like you can't handle it, but you can, right? There's other times where like you feel like you're on top of it. Like there's just, it's such a, sometimes dailies, you know, other times there's it's other increments, but sometimes it is like a daily battle with, for some people, where you kind of just have to get through the day. Like, you know, if you got through the day and everyone's safe and healthy, like that's a
Mm-hmm.
win,
Yeah.
and that's so important. And like with the intentionality of time, that I feel like that also, being intentional with your time in the season you're in, is also, that's so important to cultivate what the next season can be, right? Because if
Mm.
it's a hard season but you're intentional about how you're choosing to show up and how you're choosing to self-care, or how you're choosing to caregive for your sibling or anyone in your family, that for that matter, that can change the trajectory of how it shows up, right? And then that's with the like changing your thought patterns and how like you show up. And so for the intention of, for the, with the time intention, then how did, for your starting your business, like how did you figure out the time intention to do that?
Well, it was sometime in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. Like, talk about timing. I mean, I would never have known, but actually, maybe let me back up a little bit. Like in 2019, I lost a very dear cousin of mine to a chronic condition that could have been prevented from a lifestyle perspective. Kind of just really thinking about him, and it's difficult. He was only a few years older than I was when he passed, and he was flown into Singapore for emergency treatment. He flew in a state of being in a coma, and we had to rush him to the hospital for very very urgent care. And over the course of 5 days, I think the neurosurgeons tried to evaluate his condition to see if they could operate on him. But then they found that his condition had deteriorated too much that they could not do anything. So over the course of 5 days, we watched him progressively pass.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was very hard for me because this cousin of mine, his family, his mom is like my second mom, if you will.
Oh.
Maybe my third, because I do have a mother-in-law. So
Yeah. Now you're third. Yeah, when you're growing up, you could
yeah,
be saying that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, growing up, she was my second mom.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yes, so her family and us, we were always very, very close. And my cousins and I, we were even planning, a group of us, a group of cousins of mine. We were even thinking of doing like a cousin gathering in Indonesia, where most of them are based. So we had these grand plans. We wanted to do this, massive gathering
Yeah.
and all that, and we talk about large families in the Asian context. So yeah, for sure. So we were thinking of that, but then we had those plans. And then the next time I saw him, he was coming in horizontal on a hospital bed, on a stretcher,
Oh man.
and he was in a state of coma. It was very hard to see him pass, and I had to even break the news to his young son to tell him that, to get ready to say goodbye to his dad. That was incredibly hard, and I also had to prepare his mom, my second mom, to for the inevitable. you know
Yeah.
so that was a really difficult moment in my life in 2019 when he passed, not only because we were close, but also because of the tragic circumstances surrounding his death. I mean, the fact that the neurosurgeon looked me in the eye and said that, most likely it was his lifestyle that caused his condition to
Okay.
worsen, that really hit home very hard for me. I mean, I've always known that, like, eating, stress management, exercising, it's really important for your health. But
Yeah.
like, to think that a neurosurgeon who comes from the conventional system was telling me that, I was like, whoa, like, this has to mean something. So I was also in a state, right at that point in time. I had been, in the business consulting space for 15 years, up
Mm-hmm.
until that time, and I was doing really well, enjoying my work and all that. But that particular episode really caused me to reconsider, the trajectory that I was on. And I've always had a heart and passion for the special needs space. My younger sister, the one with MID, Priscilla, her name is. She's just so sweet. She's always told me to join. She's always invited me to join the industry as a special needs teacher. She's
Aww.
always told me that I should, teach, and maybe teach her class. I was like, wow, like this sounds, like there's a potential conflict of interest there, But
Yeah, I was
but I
just gonna
think
say like that's cool, but not her class. Maybe like another.
she might have a different agenda. Maybe she thinks I'm going to cut
Yeah.
her some slack, But in any case, she's always encouraged me to explore the space as a teacher. And but like I have the utmost respect for teachers, and I think they're some of the most patient people on earth, especially if they work in the special needs
Yeah.
education space. So. I'm still working on my patience. I'm never really quite considered myself to be suitable as a
Me
candidate.
either. My husband is much more patient. I've learned lots from him.
I know, right? We
Yeah.
chatted about that. Bless our husbands, but you know,
Yes.
it's yeah. So I and when my cousin passed, I thought long and hard about it, and for me because faith is important for me, so I given the matter over to prayer, and just seeking God and just really just trying to get a sense of what do I do with this now? Like, should I pivot into this space, and what do I do, with the special
Yeah.
needs community, and then that's how yeah, through a series of prayers being answered and being directed, I feel like my calling in this second stage of my life or my career life, it's that I really want to come into this space and support special needs caregivers. Because I'll tell you that day when my cousin passed and I was there watching him go, um, I'm sorry, mom. It sounds really morbid, but I imagine my mom being on that bed because my mom has given so much of her life to
Mm.
not only my sister, but to our entire family. I mentioned I had a very difficult childhood growing up.
Yeah.
So my mom has been through the ringer, and um, just when I watched my cousin pass, I thought of my mom because my mom's health could definitely use a boost. And I was
Yeah.
thinking, just like, what if it's her? Like, what if, like it's her that's going? Like, I don't want to lose her,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
that really, really compelled me to really pursue God and His leading and to see if this was really, something He wanted me to do or if this was something like, a figment of my imagination. And then later
Yeah.
when I had the confirmation, I knew that I would want to enter the space, and here I am. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's so exciting, and that's something where I it's just something where I am not in the space that you're in, but in terms of like knowing that like I don't think there was something specific that happened where it made me think about the bigger picture, but I think for a long time I've known that like I was put on I know I was put on the earth to do more than just like whatever my office job was. And it was
Mm-hmm.
something that when I was like starting to work, I was trying to I think what I was trying to do was make my wherever I was working, I was trying to turn that into something bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I was like, oh, maybe if I got really good with this skill set, then that would then allow me to do X, Y, Z. But the interesting thing about this podcast, right, is that like it started at a point in time where I like my spiritual life was kind of in a rougher patch, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just due to a variety of other factors that are kind of unrelated from that. But it was this thing where you like, yeah, just to see it foster and see that it wasn't it wasn't just me who needed the space. And it was just it just took on a very different like I just couldn't have ever imagined it, right? Because for all the things that I thought that I was put on the earth to do and try to do these things and like, oh, I'll just like use my skill sets because I was gifted with whatever skill sets, or I learned certain skills like from my parents or from working whatever. But it's like it's there's so much. The thing that I don't think I realized until I started doing this podcast was the level of like how important people interaction was to me.
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's not everyone's cup of tea, right? Because there are people who really they're just very good at like doing numbers, or they're doing books, or like they like make, they're like kind of in a room and they kind of like make art and then they sell it. There's so many different um abilities and skill sets that people have, but like being able to talk to people is not everyone's cup of tea. But I just do it all the time. Like, and it's this thing where I I never had was able to connect that like, oh, like that can be used to foster like good in the world, right? Because when you're growing up, you're just like, oh, people are like, oh, you talk too much, or you have to be quiet, right? Like there's all these things that you're
Yeah,
told about,
yeah,
just whatever, right? Like, I love asking questions. Like at work, I ask people tons of questions about how to do my job, because I just like asking questions, and it's something that I think that's one of the things that we talked about earlier, right? It's something where I've learned to acknowledge that can be used for a positive thing. Like, even though
yeah,
if I was told when I was younger, hey, you ask too many questions, stop asking, like that's not a bad quality, right?
yeah,
That
yeah.
it's at that time, in that space, at that age, it might have been like annoying, right? But
Mm,
like, as now, if I know how to foster it and be able to care and steward that well, I can use it for the better of whatever I'm doing, right? And then that's such a powerful thing to be, and that's the whole thing about community, right? Like that all humans were built for community, right? And we were created to
mm,
be
mm,
together, not live individualized, but
yeah.
to be able to like live in community and foster that, and and care for one another in that way. And that it's such an important thing. And even for people who I guess before that, like the thing that fascinates me is that even for every person that I've talked to, like related to this podcast, right, other siblings and stuff, like the community, regardless of where their like faith space is at, like they could have it or not have it, but everyone has acknowledged that, like, having another sibling, or just having a space to feel that you matter, and that your feelings are validated and they're real, and that your experience is a hard one, and it's not bad, but it's just hard to go through it, right? Like, everyone, that's such an important, like, milestone to acknowledge, that like you do need other people. Like, for anyone that is a sim who has not talked to anyone, probably would recommend to go talk to someone, right? And they don't have
Right.
to be another sim. It'd be great if it was, because that does create a level of bonding that doesn't. There is a level of bonding with other sims that you can't get with other people. I think that's just part of it, right? It just
Mm.
doesn't. You can't fall. You can't. You can pretend that you know, and you can try, and you can be very close to someone who knows, but it's not the same as living it.
Most
Yeah.
definitely. And you know the thing about being in community is that like it's so beautiful that we are all so different, and it doesn't really matter what our gifting is and where we find ourselves to be in life. Because the thing is that like if everybody were to be as good as you, in asking questions, then like where would be the artists? Like we wouldn't have any plumbers, we wouldn't have any art, we wouldn't have any like
Yeah.
the world would be just so boring if it was just made up of like one type of person, right?
Yeah.
Outside of this. So the thing about being in community is that like that's the beauty of it. Like we can all come to the table with our own stories and with our own strengths and our own gifts,
Yeah.
and that we can just come together and you never know where this is gonna like when I did the human book library event, like I never knew that I was going to be able to help support a mom. I mean, we ended off with a really sweetheart, and like I never could have imagined that, But
Mhm.
for whatever reasons, we connected, and then there was this bit of encouragement that I could give her, and
Yeah.
she encouraged me too because to me it was like, oh, like there is a mom who's really struggling, and then she was brave enough to come forward and ask for help. I was like,
Yeah.
wow, like I don't know what I would have done if I were to be in her situation, right? So it's amazing like what we can learn from one another, and when we're growing up, like we have a sense of like the world being as is, but like the more you grow up and the more you allow yourself to keep an open mind and continue to to be challenged in our own way of thinking, like the more you find that like it is so much more vibrant than you
Yeah.
think it. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's so
And
much more
that's
beautiful and so much more vibrant. It's really how you get it. Like, you know, when I was growing up, like I was told so much by a mentor of mine whom I look up to very, very much. He kept telling me the cup is half full, not half empty. But like, you know, when I first heard it, I hated that saying. I was like, what do you mean it's half full? It is half
no, no,
empty.
yeah, exactly. No, I was that person too. Don't worry. I'm right there with you.
It's like what do you mean? Like, can you not see like it's half here? But
Mhm.
the more I you know meditated on that and thought about that, the more I realized that he was telling me to see what was there and what was not, and not focus on what was missing, which is my human tendency to do, which is to zoom
Yeah.
in on what is lacking and what is missing. But how sad is that? And I'm so glad that, like, for me, faith is a really big part of my life. Not just, yeah, you know, everybody has to find their peace with it, you know, as to like where they stand on this. But for me, my Christian faith is really big because for the many rough things I've encountered in life, um, beyond what we are sharing here on this podcast. But I did not grow up to be a spiritual person. I did not grow up to be. I came from a background where you had to check the boxes and you had to do it, things in a particular way. Otherwise, the deities were going to punish you and that sort of thing. So it was a very intimidating environment that I was in, and
Mm.
it was only later in life when I came across the Christian faith, and I'm talking about the genuine kind, not the charismatic like
Oh, got
prosperity
it.
doctrine type, like put in money and then God will bless you. That type of that
Yeah.
doctrine. I'm not talking about that at all. But the very genuine Christian faith where it's you know that you are dependent on God and that you can have a loving fellowship and a loving relationship with Him, and that gave me a lot of strength in my caregiving journey because who am I to
Mm.
pour anything out to my sister and to my family? I mean, on my own accord, right? I know that I'm no good, like I there's only so much I can do. I can't be there for everyone,
Yeah.
but I can commit them to God in prayers. I can pray for strength. I can, think good things because He has enabled me to do so, by reading
Yeah.
His word and having my mind renewed. Otherwise on my own, what good am I, so like for
Yeah.
me faith is really big on supporting my caregiving journey. Otherwise I would not be able to see like the forest for the trees. I'll get so caught up in the weeds and not be able to
Yeah.
see the bigger picture, yeah. So yeah, I think we all have to, at least my hope is that like we all can dig a little bit deeper and see, just what is it that we are standing on. Because the last thing you want is to find that, you never know how the journey is going to be up ahead, right? It could get rocky and all that. The last thing you want is to find yourself standing on sand when all along you thought you were standing on rock. That would be
Mm.
really, really sad. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there like I think kind of like part of what you said about, you know, like our human capacity to love is only X, right? Whatever that is for
Mm,
humans, right? And I think in in the things that I've like grew up with versus the stuff that I've kind of had to like been battling with in the more recent kind of like months, right? It's been this interesting journey about, you know, the love that you can even that humans have for like themselves, right? Because there's also like I think one of the things that I'm realizing like, as we're talking, right, is that, you know, I I can only do so much to make myself feel better and to make others, you know, to love others and stuff, right? But at some point, like that has to come from another place, right?
mm. Yeah.
And I think everyone hits that at different points, and that's something that I don't think I realized until more in the last year and a half or so. Was like, you know, it's like it need that the power to be able to to love yourself enough where you you feel like you're important and that you do deserve to be able to live, right, and to have a life that you want and not one that's and your own identity, right? And not one that's necessarily attached to your sibling or your parents or whatever, right? And especially as a sibling, that's so hard to detach yourself as an identity as a sibling to someone with a
Mm.
disability, right? Like that power does need to come like from somewhere, right? And so it's this thing where I've been like it's for some for so God like it's like because I grew up like in a Christian home, right? So it's this thing where you grow up with it, so you're kind of like, oh, you just go with the status quo, but you have to realize it for yourself like in your adulthood, right? And that's been part of like my stuff that's all over the place. But one of the other things that I've learned, it's like, for other people who may not want to be like in that boat at this point in time, right? That it can be from something else, right? Like whatever the representation of a greater power is to you, like it's okay to pull from that. Like, there is a point where it and it's not to make it very spiritual, but there is an element of that is involved, just because like at the end of the day, like it's there's so much greater purpose than us humans on the earth, right? There's just more to it than that in general. And I think,
Yeah.
if that is able to help someone where they can draw that power from something, like whether it could be like more generically the universe, or there's like a spirit that they like are more in tune with, or it's God, like whatever that needs to be for them to help them get through it, then I think that's also important. And it's, and if it's God, that's great, because there's like, there's obviously a more powerful message behind that. And at the same time, it's so hard, because it's obviously there's so many feelings about like, and obviously this is dependent on where people are at with their siblings and their family situation, right? But there is a lot of like, why me, right? Why
Mm.
my sister, why my brother, why my parents? And there's a lot of that, and that's kind of more in the like, baggage burden part of the equation that we talked about earlier, right? And it takes a lot to work through that, right? And there's some people where that situation, it's more on the permanent side of that, where they might need to walk away for their own health and safety. And I think that's also something important to acknowledge, is like, it may feel hard, but like if you are unsafe, you do need to kind of find somewhere that is
Yeah, you
safer
do.
for you,
Mm.
right? Whether that's for you, your sibling, or your parents, or whatever. Like but that safety for your own well-being is so important, to be able to cultivate like who you really are as a person, right? To have your own identity, to help to kind of take care of your own self-care, to discover like kind of what you want to do on the earth with your talents, with the love capacity that you have for all these people and all these things, right? And it's so important for people to have that space to cultivate it in a place that is really just genuinely them. And that's not an easy thing to find for some people, but I think that's just something important to be said, that we spend so much time kind of holding our skill sets to make sure our siblings are okay, or our parents are okay, or like, kind of what we were talking about, the survival mode, right? We're so good at that then that could also become who we are too, right? Not even from an identity
Mm.
standpoint, but just from we spend so much energy and kind of habitual practices being in survival mode and organizing stuff and making sure like we have all this stuff for an emergency and tantrums and all these things, right? But we forget that like we have our own independent lives and
Mm.
interests
Mm.
and skill sets that like, right? Like my audio skill sets have absolutely nothing to do with my sister, but like it's something I can do, and I can cultivate it in this way, right? And that serves a greater purpose, other than, even though it's small, but it like can help fuel a bigger fire than I realize. And that's a whole other like like part of like being a human, right? There's a complexity, but there's so much beauty in that once your perspective changes, which I think that is like an age thing too. Because in my 20s, I was like, who? Like, I didn't have this insight. When you're like 22, you're like, whatever. But yeah, as you get older, it's like, okay, That's not how life is.
I'm kind of teasing, but I feel like maybe we were just being really immature when we were in our 20s because I've seen some really mature ones, but I'm just teasing. You must have been more mature than I am. I was when I was in my 20s. But Shani, what you're saying here, I feel like it's important that we see ourselves, but it's also important that we see beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
It's not to minimize our presence in our life and and our interests and who we are and all that. I totally concur what you're saying. Like we have a life of our own, to our own identity, right? And our interests and things that motivate us and all that. Those are really important, and I'm not minimizing that at all. But earlier, to your point about just the strength that we can find, to be able to care give, like where do we find this? If not in faith, then it has to be something that's beyond yourself. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you may not be able to tell, but like I am actually, I would say 50% introverted, 50% extroverted. Um, I enjoy going out and talking with people like you do. Just like even in person, even on stages. That's something I enjoy doing. But at the same time, I also enjoy my peace and quiet too.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be. They can coexist. But the reason I bring that up is because sometimes when I go up on stages to share a message, right?
Mm.
The thing that helps me the most is to remember that it is not about you. It is about the audience. It's about what can help them, what they need to hear.
Mm.
So, and that takes all the nerves out of like my sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like yes, we have to see ourselves, we have to see what we are worth, and then what we stand for. We have to have all of that, but we also need to see beyond ourselves, be able to have that strength to be able to
Yeah.
carry on in our caregiving. Otherwise, when the going gets tough, and it will get tough, it will get tough. If it has not already been tough, it's
Right.
like it will continue to be. It's just
Yeah.
gonna be the way it is. Yeah, then we were not going to have the fuel that we're gonna need to be able to run the race and last it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, thank you for rounding that out, cuz that is like the next like phase of it too, right? There's
Mm,
it you is important, also like what you're doing is important, right? And how it affects
mm,
other people and who you interact with like is also just as important. It's just you kind of need like both parts to be one. Yeah. So I guess
yeah.
speaking of other people, you have any words of encouragement for other people who are listening, for our other siblings?
Charlene, earlier you asked, sometimes we might find ourselves asking like, why me? That's a question I've asked myself too, and I don't think I've found the answer till today. And
Mm-hmm.
many of us as siblings may never find the answer in this lifetime. But I think my encouragement really to all of our siblings is that for whatever reasons, beyond us in this lifetime, out of the billions of people on this earth, you were chosen to be your sibling to your special needs, family member. And out of everybody, it could have been anyone. It could have been Joe on the street, Mary on the street, but you
Mm-hmm.
were chosen to be that sibling to that special needs person. So I feel, embrace it, enjoy it, and yeah, it is. There's yes, caregiving is tough, but there is so much out of it that's so rewarding and fulfilling too. If we have our heart in the right place, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, have fun with your sibling. They may not be around for very long. I think I was reading an article penned by a very, very dear gentleman who was bemoaning the loss of his sister with MID, at the age of
Mm-hmm.
50. When I read it, I was incredibly moved to tears, and I didn't even know that gentleman. But it got me thinking too, Sometimes I think about caregiving as being a lifelong endeavor, and it may well be. But in that particular gentleman's story, his sister passed so early on in life, so my encouragement really is that enjoy the journey while you are on it. When we look left and look right and we bemoan it, it will be over before you know it. So just enjoy the ride, enjoy the journey. Yeah, and treasure our loved ones while we still have them with us. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for being on the podcast. And as a bonus, you actually have made a download for everyone, for our listeners, for to help with their self care. So did you want to talk about it for a little bit, and then we can then we'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the download is really intended to help us think about our health goal. There's a lot of yeah, we talk about self care, the need to better our health and that sort of thing. But the thing is that with goal getting or goal setting, sometimes it can be very nebulous. Like we don't really quite know where to get started. And how many of us have like set New Year resolutions and then only to have to restart them in February or March, or
Yeah.
like we have really forgotten
I've done
about
that
them?
many times.
Yeah, so have I. Up until the time, because up until the time where I've in a way found a way to do that goal setting process to help, and that's the same process I use with my clients as well to help them gain clarity on their health goal and also just have a more concrete plan to act on it. Yeah, so I'm happy to share that with the listeners of the Special Needs Sibling podcast. Please feel free to reach out and just share your feedback and how that's helping you. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Exciting things. Well, that's all we got. So thank you, Sharon, for being on the podcast. And yeah.
Thank you, Charlene. Really enjoyed our chat today. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Special Needs Sibling Podcast. If you're new here, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help more siblings and friends find us. You can also support the podcast by donating on Ko-fi. That's Ko-fi. You can check out the link in the description for more info. If you're a special needs sibling, I hope you feel encouraged and validated in your journey. If you're not a sibling but know someone who is, I hope you learned a little bit more about what their life is like. That's all for now, and until next time, this is the Special Needs Sibling Podcast.